They say betrayal feels like a knife to the heart, but for me, it was a smile across the table. A smile from the woman I once called my best friend, as she clinked her glass to toast my marriage, knowing full well she'd been sleeping with my husband. My name is Isabelle. I'm 32 years old. I'm the sort of woman people call composed, even when my world burns around me. I don't cry in public. I don't scream. I wait, I think, and then I act. I met Daniel when I was 26, ambitious, intelligent, outwardly kind. We married 4 years later in a slow, expensive ceremony under the oaks of my family's old vineyard. The kind of wedding that people post about. The kind of marriage that looks perfect from the outside. But inside, I had started to sense something off in the last year. Late-night work calls. Sudden weekend conferences. The distance between us growing quietly, like ivy up the walls of our home. And then there was Claire. My oldest friend. We met in high school and had grown into adulthood side by side, through heartbreaks, new jobs, and losses. She was one of those people who could charm a room with a laugh. She had a way of making people feel seen, even when she wasn't really looking. I always thought of her as the one person who truly understood me. We'd talk late into the night over wine, cry into each other's shoulders during breakups, and promise, again and again, that we'd never let life come between us. Except life had. And it had done so in the worst possible way. The signs had been there, in hindsight. Claire always arrived just a little too early when Daniel was around. She laughed a little too hard at his jokes, lingered just a second too long when they said goodbye. I caught glances, shared looks, and once, a whisper between them that stopped abruptly the moment I entered the room. But I told myself I was being paranoid. That I was exhausted. That wedding planning, a stressful job, and the recent death of my father were clouding my judgment. I even asked Claire, once. Half joking, over coffee. I said, "You're not trying to steal my fiancé, are you?" She laughed. Tipped her head back and smiled in that bright, careless way of hers. She said, "Please. If I wanted Daniel, I would have had him years ago." It was a strange answer. I remember noting that. Not a no. Not even close. But I let it go. Because I wanted to believe her. Because I was afraid of what it would mean if I didn't. My father's death had left a hole in our family, and a mess. He'd passed suddenly, a heart attack in the vineyard. He was the quiet pillar of our household, a man who lived by principles, who believed that dignity mattered more than noise. We weren't wealthy, but the land had been in our family for generations, and my father had left it all to me. That had caused its own quiet war. My younger brother had expected to inherit the vineyard. My mother wanted it sold. But my father had trusted me, and he'd told me why. "You see people clearly, Isabelle," he once said. "You don't flinch when the truth gets ugly." I think of those words often now. The week before the wedding, I found a text on Daniel's phone. It was short. Just a heart emoji, a room number, and the letter C. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I needed to be sure. I needed something undeniable. Something I couldn't explain away, even to myself. So I waited. And on the day of my wedding, when the music swelled and guests rose and my mother dabbed tears from her eyes, I smiled. I said my vows. I kissed my husband. And later that night, at the reception, I watched Claire walk in, radiant in burgundy silk, her arm brushing Daniel's just a little too familiarly as they passed each other at the bar. I made my way across the room, heels quiet on the wooden floor, glass in hand. I smiled at Claire. I smiled at Daniel. And I said, loud enough for everyone at our table to hear, "How long has this been going on?" Claire blinked. Daniel froze. And in that silence, that sharp, shocked, breathless silence, I felt something in me finally shift. But that was just the beginning. Because what came next, what I did next, is what changed everything. Shock has a way of silencing a room faster than any scream. For a long moment, all I could hear was the clink of someone setting down a fork, and the blood rushing in my ears. Claire didn't say a word. Daniel opened his mouth, then shut it. The color had drained from both their faces. I remember the flicker of a candle nearby, casting shadows across the linen tablecloth. The sharp scent of white lilies in the centerpiece suddenly made me nauseous. Someone laughed nervously across the room, unaware of what had just cracked open at our table. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. Their stillness was louder than any denial. I walked away from the table, found my reflection in the window pane near the terrace. I looked calm. Polished. Like someone who had just toasted to her future, not detonated her past. That's the thing about women like me, we're taught from a young age that our value lies in our ability to carry pain gracefully. And I was very, very graceful. I didn't cry that night. I didn't raise my voice. I danced with my cousins, hugged my aunts, thanked every guest who complimented the flowers or my dress. I smiled through the pain, not to fool anyone else, but to remind myself I could. When the last guest left and the venue emptied out, I stood in the bridal suite alone, staring at the lace train pulled on the floor. My dress felt heavier than it had that morning. I sat down at the edge of the chaise and reached for the bottle of champagne Claire had gifted me, a vintage rose with a handwritten note that read, "For your forever." I didn't drink it. Instead, I placed it gently into the trash bin, the note still tied to its neck with silver ribbon. In the weeks that followed, I kept up appearances. Publicly, Daniel and I were the same, newly married, newly blissful. But privately, I was unraveling the seams of every lie, every moment, every half-smile exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. I reviewed timelines, excuses, business trips. It all began to make a terrible kind of sense. The betrayal cut twice, once from the man I had trusted with my future, and again from the woman who had shared my past. Claire and I had grown up together in Sonoma. Her family lived just down the road, her parents were charming in a brittle, ambitious way. Her mother, a gallery curator with a sharp voice and an obsession with perception. Her father, quiet and financially reckless, always looking for his next big gamble. My mother used to say, "Claire's family is glitter, not gold." But I never listened. I needed Claire then. She made life feel cinematic, big, chaotic, electric. I was the quiet one, the planner, the one who remembered birthdays and wrote thank you notes. Claire was the fire. I covered for her in high school when she snuck out. I drove her home from parties when she drank too much. When she got into NYU and I chose to stay closer to home, she told me, "You're the steady one, Izzy. I wish I had your roots." Now I realize that what she called steady, she saw as weak. And Daniel, well, he never knew how much of my strength was quiet. He and Claire had never crossed boundaries publicly. No late-night texts that I could find, no photos. Just tension. Just gut instinct. But I did find one thing, a reservation history in Daniel's email. A hotel an hour outside the city. Booked 3 times in 6 months. Always midweek. Always paid in cash. I printed them. Slipped them into an envelope. Labeled it in my neatest handwriting, "I see you." And I mailed it, not to Daniel, not to Claire. But to Claire's mother. I knew she read every line of Claire's life like a resume, every boyfriend vetted, every mistake buried. She'd built her daughter into a product. Let her see what she'd made. That was the beginning of the shift in me. It's strange how grief makes room for clarity. I stopped asking why. I stopped giving either of them space in my mind that I could fill with silence instead. Instead, I returned to the Vineyard. My father's land. The one thing I'd kept separate from Daniel. He'd wanted to invest, to modernize the brand. But I'd refused, partly out of sentimentality, partly out of instinct. Thank God I did. The old farmhouse needed repairs. The main house had cracks in the plaster, and the vines needed pruning. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. Not physically, I'm no farmer, but I hired the right people. Quiet, competent, respectful. I poured my attention into soil reports, weather patterns, wine futures. My father had loved this land because it required patience and discipline. And that's exactly what I had. Claire tried to reach out once. A message, vague and cautious, "I miss you. I never wanted to hurt you." I didn't reply. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had nothing left to give her. My brother called not long after, asking about the estate. Subtle questions wrapped in concern. Had I considered selling? Wasn't it a lot for one person to manage? Was I okay? I told him I was fine. I told him everything was under control. He didn't know that I'd already hired a lawyer. Not for a divorce. Not yet. But to protect the vineyard. To ensure it was untouchable, no matter what storm might come next. I started having long, quiet dinners on the porch, watching the sun settle into the rows of vines. Some nights, I felt the ache of it all, not just Daniel, not just Claire, but the way I had shaped myself around everyone else's needs for so long. It's not the betrayal that breaks you. It's the realization that you saw it coming, and still hoped you were wrong. One night, I opened the bottle of wine my father had saved for my wedding. A vintage from the year I was born, rich, complex, aging beautifully. I drank a single glass. And as I sat there, the breeze brushing the hem of my dress, the porch creaking beneath me, I finally asked myself a question I had avoided for too long. Not why they did it, but why I let it go on. And that question, quiet, sharp, insistent, was what led me to the decision I made the next morning. Some decisions arrive like lightning. Others bloom slowly in the quiet, painful, deliberate, and irreversible. The morning after that glass of wine, I walked through the vineyard barefoot, dew clinging to my ankles, the sun still a shy smear behind the hills. I didn't carry my phone. I didn't bring a plan. Just my breath, the weight in my chest, and the need to do something that belonged only to me. I found myself at the old toolshed near the southern grove, where my father had once kept spare parts and weathered notebooks full of forecasts. I hadn't opened it since his death. Inside, dust floated like ghost light in the slats of morning sun, and a faint scent of motor oil and rosemary lingered, his scent. The grief returned in a way I hadn't expected, not sharp this time, but wide and hollow. I sat on the wooden stool he used when he needed quiet, and I let the silence wrap around me. I remembered what he'd told me when I was 15, the summer Daniel and I met, before he was anything to me, before the possibility of betrayal had touched my world. My father said, "People will test your kindness, Isabelle. They'll confuse your grace for weakness. Let them. Just don't confuse it yourself." I hadn't realized how much I had. In the weeks after the wedding, the pressure came quietly. First through Daniel's attempts to normalize. He left notes in the kitchen. Sent texts about dinner. Called me love in the voice he reserved for public moments. He wanted to believe it hadn't happened. That if we didn't speak of it, it could be undone. He underestimated my silence. He said once, "I know things have been strained. But I want us to move forward." I replied, "You already did." I didn't say more. I didn't need to. Then came Claire's efforts. She reached out again, an email this time. Longer. Apologetic, but not in the way that mattered. She wrote about confusion. About timing. About how she never meant for anything to happen. She said Daniel had been distant. That she had been lonely. That lines had blurred. It read like a woman trying to paint her guilt into a shade soft enough to live with. She ended the message with, "I hope one day you can forgive me." I closed the laptop and didn't open it again that day. Forgiveness is such a strange request from someone who never asked permission in the first place. But the real pressure didn't come from them. It came from my mother. She arrived at the vineyard unannounced one afternoon, carrying a loaf of bakery bread and that brittle smile she always wore when trying to make peace without acknowledging there was ever a war. We sat on the patio. She spread butter on the bread and spoke as if we were discussing rainfall, not betrayal. she said, I think you need to be realistic, Isabelle. Marriages are complicated. People make mistakes. I didn't answer. She continued, your father wasn't perfect either, you know. But I stayed. I looked at her, the way I'd looked at her 1,000 times as a girl, searching for approval, for recognition, for some indication that my pain mattered. I found none. I said, you stayed because you were afraid of being alone. I'm not. That was the last time she visited. The isolation after that was dense. The kind that fills every corner of the room, even when you're surrounded by people. The vineyard workers were kind but distant. The lawyer I'd hired was efficient, professional. We spoke only when necessary. Even friends, the few who remained after the wedding, didn't know how to ask the right questions, the ones I might have answered. But there was one exception. Marina. She wasn't someone I'd known well before. She was my father's estate manager, someone he'd trusted implicitly, someone I'd always thought of as background. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, with a way of listening that made silence feel purposeful. We began having lunch on Thursdays. At first it was logistical, reviewing budgets, projections, seasonal plans. But over time, we spoke more freely. Or rather, I did. She rarely interrupted. One afternoon, I told her everything. The wedding, the affair, the silence since. I hadn't planned to. The words simply fell out of me like stones I'd carried too long. When I finished, she said nothing for a long while. Then, she said, you know, your father trusted you for a reason. You see people clearly. You just don't always act on what you see. It wasn't criticism. It was a mirror. And she was right. That night, I pulled out every financial record I had access to, Daniel's accounts, our joint assets, the prenup we'd both signed but never spoken of again. I read every line. I highlighted every loophole. I began to build a plan, not for vengeance, not for drama, but for freedom. I learned, for example, that Daniel had used our marriage to leverage new investor relationships. That he'd named me in business proposals as a co-signer. That the appearance of stability, of success, had become his greatest asset. And I was that asset. Quietly, I began withdrawing. Legally. Financially. Strategically. I didn't make noise. I didn't issue threats. I moved my name off everything he'd used it for. I notified banks. I locked credit. I changed permissions. He noticed eventually. He sent messages. Called. He said, Isabelle, what are you doing? I replied, protecting what's mine. The day I filed for separation, I didn't cry. I signed the papers in a navy dress, my father's old watch on my wrist. I went home and opened the window to let in the vineyard breeze. I expected relief. But what I felt was something quieter. Not peace. Not yet. But the beginning of it. What I didn't expect, though, what came next, was the letter that arrived in the mail 3 days later. It wasn't from Daniel. It was from Claire. Handwritten. No return address. And inside, something I hadn't anticipated. A photo. One I hadn't seen before. And in the corner, barely visible, a date. A date that didn't align with anything Daniel had told me. Some lies live in shadows. Others are captured in light, frozen in time, waiting to be found. The photo was printed on glossy paper, tucked inside an unmarked envelope. Claire's handwriting was delicate, almost apologetic, on the card that accompanied it. She hadn't written much, just 2 sentences and her signature. I thought you deserved the truth. I'm sorry. The image was of a hotel balcony, unmistakable. The hills in the background told me it was the resort Daniel claimed to have visited for a conference in January, 2 months before the wedding. In the foreground, he stood with his back to the camera, shirtless, leaning into Claire's neck as she laughed, wrapped in nothing but a towel. Her hand, the one with the tiny scar above her wrist from when we were 16, rested on his hip. But it was the timestamp that silenced me. January 6th. The night I'd taken my mother to the emergency room with chest pain. The night I'd driven Daniel to the airport afterward, watching him disappear behind the security gate with a kiss on my forehead and a lie in his mouth. I stared at the photo for a long time. Not in shock, not anymore, but in stillness. Like someone sitting at the edge of a well, measuring its depth not by what she can see, but by what she can no longer hear. Something in me hardened that day. Not with anger. With clarity. There was no confusion anymore, no room left for doubt or misplaced empathy. Claire hadn't just crossed a line, she'd documented it, framed it, and then handed it to me as if confession might buy her grace. It didn't. But what it did buy was time. Because now I had evidence. Not just a suspicion, not just a feeling. Something real. Tangible. Dangerous, if I chose it to be. I didn't tell anyone. Not Marina, not the lawyer, not even Daniel. I tucked the photo and card into the same drawer where I kept the copies of his hotel receipts and the contract for our prenuptial agreement. Then I opened my laptop and began mapping every asset, every point of contact, every intersection between my life and his that still existed. I didn't want revenge. I wanted closure. But closure required precision. And I was tired of bleeding for people who sharpened their knives in my silence. I hired a second lawyer. A woman this time. She came highly recommended by Marina, whose connections surprised me more each day. Her name was Dahlia, and she was not warm, but she was exact, the kind of person who made you feel your words would be cross-examined before they even left your mouth. We met at a small office in town. No signage. Just a brass plate and a door that locked behind you. Dahlia asked, "What do you want?" I replied, "To reclaim my name without destroying myself in the process." She didn't blink. She just opened a folder and started taking notes. Over the next 2 weeks, I handed her everything. The prenup. The bank statements. The messages. The image. She read without comment, underlining sections in her notes, occasionally circling something. Once, she paused. She said, "He listed your business assets as marital property in a joint financing application." I looked at her. She said, "It didn't go through. But the attempt matters." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch wrapped in my father's old sweater, listening to the vineyard sigh in the wind. The sky was cloudless, stars hung in stillness above me, and the scent of earth and rosemary lingered. I thought about how many times I'd chosen quiet over conflict. How often I'd made myself smaller to keep the peace. How long I'd believed that enduring pain made me noble. But nobility didn't rebuild your life. Strategy did. The next morning, I made a list. At the top, secure the vineyard. Not just legally, emotionally. It needed to become mine in more than name. So I walked the property, section by section, with Marina. We reviewed operations, staff, upcoming harvests. I asked questions I hadn't asked before. Listened with new ears. I signed contracts for renovations. Approved branding updates. And I registered a new LLC, one that had no trace of Daniel's involvement, no shared history. Just me. Next, remove Daniel from my financial image. Dahlia worked swiftly. We issued letters to financial institutions, notified them of the separation, cited misuse of marital information. She filed motions quietly, avoiding public records where possible, preserving my name and limiting his reach. Third, protect myself emotionally. This one was harder. I began therapy with a woman named Colette, recommended by someone at the lawyer's office. Colette had soft hands and a hard gaze. She didn't ask about Claire or Daniel. She asked about me. What did I want, if they didn't exist? I didn't know. But I showed up each week, anyway. There was one moment, mid-session, when she asked me to describe what forgiveness would look like. I told her, It looks like never having to think about them again. She smiled. Not kindly. She said, that's erasure. Not forgiveness. I didn't respond. Because sometimes erasure is the closest thing we can manage. Around that time, Daniel requested a meeting. His tone was careful, clipped. Not angry, cautious. I agreed. At a neutral location, during daylight, with a witness. He arrived 10 minutes late, looking tired. I watched him sit across from me and reach for his water glass like it was a shield. He said, I think we both made mistakes. I didn't flinch. He said, I don't want this to become a war. I replied, then don't turn it into one. His eyes searched mine for softness. There was none. He said, you're not the same. I replied, no. I'm not. He asked about the vineyard. I changed the subject. He asked about Claire. I said nothing. Eventually, he stood. He said, you're different than I thought. I replied, that was your first mistake. And then I left. I didn't look back. The next day, Claire called again. I let it go to voicemail. She said, I never expected it to get this far. I need to talk to you. I didn't return the call. But I knew what she meant. It had gotten farther than either of them expected. And I hadn't even started the final part of my plan. Not yet. Some confrontations don't explode. They unfold, slow, deliberate, undeniable. It started with a call from Dahlia, crisp and emotionless as always. She said, the financial audit is complete. There's something you need to see. I met her the next morning at her office. Pale sunlight filtered through the blinds as she slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a summary of Daniel's attempts to restructure our shared investments without my knowledge, shifting assets between shell accounts, manipulating valuations. He hadn't just crossed ethical lines. He'd danced across legal ones. I said nothing for a long time. Dahlia said, it's enough to press charges, if you want. But I didn't want prosecution. I wanted precision. I wanted truth to land like a gavel in a room full of silence. So we scheduled the meeting. Neutral location. Legal representation on both sides. Dahlia would be there. So would Daniel's attorney, a man I'd only met once, briefly, during a charity gala years ago. Polished, condescending, always smiling with his mouth but never with his eyes. And Claire. She wasn't required to be there. But I invited her anyway. Not out of cruelty. Out of completion. She'd written apologies, sent letters, tried to nudge the door open with vague regrets. I wanted her to sit in the room she helped set on fire. The morning of the meeting, I dressed simply. Navy blouse, dark jeans, clean hair pulled back. No jewelry except for my father's watch and a single pearl pin, a quiet nod to the parts of me no one had managed to take. I arrived early. Dahlia was already there, reading through notes. She didn't ask if I was ready. She knew I was. Daniel walked in first. He looked thinner, drawn around the mouth. A suit that once fit him like confidence now hung with uncertainty. He glanced at me, then away. Claire arrived second. Late by 5 minutes, eyes shadowed, face bare. She wore a long coat, as if expecting cold, though the room was warm. She sat in the corner. Silent. Watching. Dahlia began. She read from the report in a measured tone, outlining the transfers, the forged digital approvals, the misuse of my name. Daniel's lawyer interrupted twice. She silenced him with citations. When she finished, she slid copies of the documentation across the table. Daniel's fingers hesitated before picking it up. His voice was thin. He said, this was never meant to hurt you. I replied, but it did. Claire looked down. Daniel tried again. He said, I thought we could work through this. Privately. I looked at the paper in front of him. My signature, falsified. My credit, leveraged. My trust, gutted. I said, "You thought wrong." Dahlia outlined our proposal. Full financial separation. Reimbursement for all unauthorized transactions. Withdrawal from pending joint investments. A binding non-disparagement agreement. No contest divorce filing. Quiet. Final. Daniel's lawyer requested time to review. Claire finally spoke. She said, "I didn't know about the money." I swear. I didn't look at her. She said, "It wasn't supposed to go this far." I replied, "But it did." The room was still. Daniel signed the initial acknowledgement without looking up. His lawyer's pen clicked twice before scribbling his own name. Dahlia gathered the papers. She said, "We'll send the final documents by end of week." Daniel stood. So did Claire. I stayed seated. They hesitated, waiting. For what, I'm not sure. Absolution, maybe. Some final gesture that would let them carry less weight on their way out. But I had nothing left to give. So they left. The door closed softly behind them. I sat in the silence. And for the first time in months, I exhaled without shaking. Later that night, I returned to the vineyard. The sky was pale with stars. I walked the rows in silence, fingers brushing against the leaves like prayer beads. Each step steady. Each breath my own. I paused at the edge of the property where the southern fence meets the old gravel path. There, leaning against the gate, was Marina. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. We stood there for a while, two women bound not by blood or betrayal, but by choice. She handed me a folded piece of paper. A proposal. A quiet offer to expand the vineyard's production line, something my father had once dreamed of, something I'd always deferred. She said, "It's time." And it was. But as I walked back to the house, something else was waiting for me. A voicemail. One I hadn't expected. My mother's voice, tight and strained. She said, "Your brother's been asking about the vineyard. I think you should be careful." I stood in the kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, the light above me flickering slightly. Because just when I thought the worst had passed, a new kind of storm had begun to gather. Betrayal, when it comes from strangers, is survivable. When it comes from blood, it stains differently. I stood there in my kitchen, the glow of the under-cabinet light soft against the tile, listening to my mother's voice dissolve into static. My brother. Of course it would be him next. I should have known that silence from his end wasn't peace, it was patience. Waiting to strike until the dust had just barely settled. I poured a glass of water and sat at the dining table without turning on the overhead lights. The vineyard outside the window was quiet, moonlit. Still mine, for now. My brother, Mason, was not someone I'd ever feared. Not in the traditional sense. He was charming, always smiling in family photos, always deflecting attention away from consequence. He'd floated from job to job for most of his adult life, skating just above failure with the help of my parents' subtle interventions. My father had once called him the social one, as though likability was a substitute for integrity. I'd always been the one to clean up after his collapses. The missed rent. The mysterious overdrafts. The quiet borrowing of our father's truck for a project that turned out to be a girlfriend's cross-country move. I had forgiven more than I remembered. And it was always forgiven, because that was what kept the family functional, enabling, masked as love. But this time, there would be no cleanup. The next morning, he called. I didn't answer. Then came the texts. Light-hearted at first, like nothing had shifted. Then inquisitive. Then demanding. I watched the tone shift in real time, the unraveling of his patience. Finally, I answered. He said, "We should talk." I replied, "About what?" He paused. He said, "The vineyard, Izzy. You know Dad wanted us to share it." I exhaled slowly. I said, "That's not what his will says." He laughed. A forced, familiar sound. He said, "Come on. Legal doesn't always mean right." I replied, "It does to me." And I ended the call. The lawyer confirmed my suspicions within days. Mason had reached out, under the guise of clarification, asking whether the estate could be challenged. He had no grounds, the documentation was clean, airtight. But he was testing. Circling. The same week, a zoning official visited the vineyard unexpectedly. A supposed routine inspection. But when I asked further, it turned out someone had submitted an anonymous complaint, questions about soil runoff, pest control. Fabricated, but strategic. Time-consuming. I handled it. Professionally, quietly. But the message was clear. Mason wasn't coming for the vineyard through law. He was coming through erosion, of time, of energy, of patience. I didn't respond. Instead, I expanded. I met with Marina and signed off on a new storage facility. I approved a marketing initiative that would finally push our wines into regional boutiques. I reached out to a small vineyard in the neighboring valley and offered a joint event, harvest tasting, co-branded, intentional. Each step was a brick. A wall. A boundary. Mason responded with silence. Then came the article. A piece in the local paper, seemingly benign, about legacy vineyards in the area. I was quoted, briefly, from a conversation I didn't recall having. But Mason's name appeared as a consultant, offering insight on modern sustainability challenges. It was subtle. But it was a foot in the narrative. And I recognized it for what it was. Reputation. I'd been so focused on financial separation, legal protection, physical security. I hadn't prepared for the emotional optics. Mason was crafting a version of events where he was involved, connected, part of the story. Because if you insert yourself into enough stories, eventually people forget you were never part of the truth. So I responded, not publicly, but decisively. I hosted a media day at the vineyard. Invited journalists. Local bloggers. Sommeliers from nearby regions. I walked them through the rows myself. I spoke plainly. Not about drama. Not about Mason. But about legacy, what it meant, how it felt, why it mattered. I said, this vineyard isn't just my inheritance. It's my responsibility. And they listened. The article that followed was longer. More thoughtful. My name was everywhere, tied to expansion, to preservation, to forward momentum. Mason didn't call again. Claire did. I hadn't heard from her in weeks. The message was brief. She was moving. Out of the state. Starting over. She wished me peace. I felt nothing. I deleted it without responding. There was a quiet week after that. The vineyard buzzed with late summer energy. The staff moved with rhythm. Orders came in steadily. The new branding designs arrived from the agency, elegant, understated, intentional. I approved them without revision. I took walks in the evenings, tracing my father's old paths. Sometimes I'd stop by the toolshed, sit on his stool, and let the air wrap around me like memory. It didn't hurt the way it used to. The ache had softened into something else. Not quite healing, but close. One afternoon, Marina found me in the office. She said, "Someone dropped this off at the gate." It was a small package. No return label. Inside, a photo album. At first I didn't understand. Then I opened it. Claire's handwriting on the first page, "For when you're ready to remember who you were before all of this." The photos were old. Childhood. Teen years. College. Claire and I, arms draped, faces flushed with laughter, frozen in moments that felt impossibly distant. But also, undeniable. We had loved each other once. Not romantically. Not with envy. But with something real. And then it was ruined. I closed the album. I didn't throw it away. I placed it on the bottom shelf of my bookcase, spine turned inward. Because some endings deserve space, even when they no longer deserve presence. The next morning, Dahlia called. She said, "The final documents are processed. You're free." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. She said, "What's next?" And I hesitated. Not because I didn't know. But because, for the first time in months, I did. Freedom doesn't arrive with a bang. It slips in through small, unassuming moments, a clear sky, an unopened message, a deep breath that doesn't end in ache. After Dahlia's call, I sat by the window for a long time. The morning light touched everything, the counter, the floor, the rim of my untouched coffee. I expected to feel triumphant, even relieved. But what I felt, quietly, was space. A quiet widening inside me, like something had finally unlatched. The final paperwork was done. My name was my own again. Legally. Financially. Personally. There were no more ties to sever, no more messages to ignore, no more past to manage. Just the slow, deliberate turning toward what came next. I spent the next week in motion. Not rushed, intentional. The vineyard entered its next phase of harvest, and the crew moved with practiced ease. I joined them sometimes, not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the season. Dirt under my nails. The resistance of vine. The sound of shears clipping new fruit. I met with Marina every morning at dawn. We didn't talk about Daniel. Or Claire. Or Mason. We talked about logistics, orders, temperatures. Then we shared coffee on the stone steps by the western field. She'd read the newspaper. I'd scribble notes in a lined notebook I'd found tucked in the back of my father's desk. Legacy, it turns out, is not built through blood. It's built through repetition. Intention. Presence. One morning, she handed me a small box. Inside was a new key. Gold-plated. Subtle. She said, "For the new gate. The one we added by the southern road." I turned it over in my palm, nodding. Ownership is a strange thing. It's less about possession and more about stewardship. Less about keeping, more about protecting. I wasn't protecting this vineyard out of spite anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply holding it, as my father had, with quiet hands and clear eyes. I began spending evenings in the main house again. I'd avoided it after he passed, keeping to the guest wing. But something shifted. I moved back into the master bedroom. Opened windows. Aired out closets. Let light in. I unpacked old boxes, sorting through photos, receipts, yellowed recipes written in my grandmother's handwriting. There was no rush. Just return. The photo album Claire had left me remained untouched. But it no longer haunted me. It was just an object now, a relic of another version of us that had long since ceased to be real. I considered sending it back, but decided against it. Let the past stay where it landed. Mason stayed quiet. I assumed he'd been advised, legally, socially. The vineyard was no longer an opening. It was a wall. Still, I took precautions. Extra counsel. Updated contracts. Clear communication with staff. Not out of paranoia, but because I'd learned, security isn't weakness. It's self-respect. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I received an invitation to a regional winemakers summit, the kind of event my father used to attend, where small producers gathered to talk soil, flavor, yield. It was being hosted at a nearby estate. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I RSVP'd yes. At the event, I met people who had known my family for years. Some offered condolences, late but genuine. Others simply nodded in quiet recognition. A few remembered me as a child, tagging behind my father, asking questions about barrels and tannins. There was no talk of Daniel. No whispers of scandal. Time, it seems, knows how to do its work. I gave a short talk on sustainable practices and regional preservation. Nothing flashy. Just honest. And afterward, a woman approached me, older, with weathered hands and a knowing smile. She said, "Your father would be proud." I nodded, swallowing something unnameable. Not grief. Not anymore. Just the echo of having carried someone's hopes long enough for them to become your own. I left before sunset, driving home slowly along the winding roads. The hills stretched golden in the light, vines casting long shadows. My hands on the wheel were steady. I didn't listen to music. Just the hum of the tires and the soft whine through the open window. When I pulled into the gravel drive, I saw Marina standing by the gate. She waved once, casually, then disappeared into the vines. I sat in the car for a moment longer. And then, without thinking, I whispered, "Thank you." To no one in particular. Maybe to myself. That night, I walked barefoot through the house, lights dim, a glass of wine in hand. I passed the mirror in the hallway and caught my reflection. Still me, but lighter. Not unscarred. Not untouched. But whole. Before bed, I lit a candle in the kitchen window. My father used to do that whenever a storm was coming. A signal. A steady light. Not everything needed to be loud to be clear. I thought about Claire once more. About how betrayal doesn't always destroy you. Sometimes it reveals you. She hadn't broken me. She'd returned me to myself. And Daniel, well. Some people are lessons. Others are consequences. He had been both. As I climbed into bed, I looked at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me. The night was warm, the air still. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to check my phone. Or brace myself. Or carry anyone else's silence. I just closed my eyes and let the stillness hold me. Because peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the refusal to let it live inside you anymore.